This is Hope Incorporated Australia. We engage with citizens and communities to help achieve better, responsible environmental protection and stewardship, locally, nationally and globally. We work from and adjacent to the traditional lands of the Gayabal, Jadawa and Yugara peoples of southeast Queensland, and we acknowledge our deep respect for the inspiring, protective nature stewardship carried out by First Nations communities around the world for thousands of years. A warm welcome to Imagining 2040 Pathways to Flourishing Futures, a podcast from Hope Incorporated Australia. I'm your host, Andrew Nicholson. In this digital space, we want to reinvigorate the often overlooked power of public imagination and future visioning. Our own vision for this podcast project is to help grow a creative, values-driven community of imaginative, bigger picture thinkers, people who collaborate, share ideas, and help map plausible, credible pathways towards futures that will be climate safer, properly nature protected, socially more supportive, and economically fairer in the share out of resources, futures which will leave no one behind. Each episode will offer simple but energising future visioning exercises designed to spark your imagination and help you picture what a thriving, more inclusive and sustainable future could look like for you and your community. Because the future is not a fixed destination. It is being shaped every day by the decisions we make individually and collectively. Together we can choose to make different future development decisions that serve the many, not the few, and we can push harder for the major system-level changes needed to make those better futures real. Over time, we hope imaginative, citizen-generated, visionary thinking can help amplify public calls for a just transition toward flourishing future development and fuel the push for the major progressive reforms needed to get there. Our pilot episodes explore some of those future reform possibilities in education, in citizen involvement in development planning, and in environmental protection advocacy. If you like what you hear, we'll expand the series with more visionary topics and voices, and we'll keep inviting your ideas, your input, and your imagination to help shape our future direction. So, put on your imaginative future vision thinking caps and join me and my guests as we chart positive, credible pathways toward a flourishing 2040 and beyond. I look forward to your company.
And so we know from research that if you are trying to get change at a system level that requires government to act, you need to be very clear and coherent in your message, and it needs to be shared by a range of groups. So it is optimistic because obviously each group has a particular thing that they're passionate about, that they want to advocate for. But, what we would like to see obviously is a bit more consistency and a bit more coherence in the types of demands and the way they're communicating those demands from some of the climate change groups.
In this episode, my guest, Dr. Andrew JOYCE from the Centre for Social Impact at Swinburne University of Technology, Australia, delves into how systems thinking, social movements and policy innovation could come together to spark transformative change, locally and nationally. And we consider the enduring legacy of the late Donella H. Meadows, an influential environmental scientist, educator and systems thinker. Her 1999 work, titled Leverage Points, Places to Intervene in a System, has become a foundational reference for many of those striving to shift deeply entrenched patterns and bring about sustainable human development. As someone who has helped build on this legacy, we speak with Dr. JOYCE about how he and his colleagues adapted Professor Meadows' Leverage Points model. In a 2023 research paper, they used a blend of systems thinking combined with insights from political science in the form of the Intervention Level Framework, or ILF, developed by Professor Finegood and colleagues, in turn based on Meadows' Leverage Points model. We talk about how, subject to further research and development, this ILF approach might help climate advocacy and other environmental protection groups frame their reform strategies and policy influence outcomes far more effectively. So, a warm welcome, Andrew, and let's start the conversation today by inviting you to give us a short introduction to you and your work.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Andrew. Really appreciate this opportunity to talk about our research. So, as you said, I'm at the Centre for Social Impact at Swinburne, and we do a lot of research and evaluation work around social issues. At the moment, a lot of work around disability employment, but also around homelessness, family violence, and social welfare provision. So we get commissioned by government to do a lot of research and evaluation. We also tender for work in the sector as well. The research I'm going to be talking with you today, though, is something that we don't normally do, which is around some climate change work. And that came out of some systems thinking and some systems work. So that's the kind of thing that we're going to be talking about today.
Well, thanks for that, Andrew. And let's get further straight away into that conversation we've started and build on that short introduction by asking you a couple of linked questions. Tell us a bit more, can you, about how you developed your interest and energy for the work you're doing today in 2025, and you've just sort of pointed to that in outline, but also what thoughts you might have on how your work going forward might be able to get us onto some better future development paths by 2040, by which I mean paths more likely to take us toward the sort of flourishing futures I outlined in the introduction to the episode.
Yeah, I suppose I can answer this in a couple of ways. The first, in terms of the social issues that we're working on, there's always obviously an agenda in relation to, these kind of issues around family violence, or whether it be homelessness, or whether it be disability employment. So obviously we're working on these kind of social issues because the statistics tell us there is a problem. And also, the lived experience as well. So a flourishing future, obviously, in that sense, would be trying to actually see an improvement in these kind of indicators and improvement in people's lived experience. So disability employment, increasing rates of employment, so parity between people without disability and people with disability. That's something that we're working on and at the moment, but the same for any particular social issue, wanting to see, And so our role in our centre is to try and assist the sector in terms of, what the evidence base is for particular policies and programs, and to help give feedback in relation to policies and programs that are being implemented. So that's the kind of broad sense of our work. In relation to climate change, we're looking at this from a systems evaluation point of view, which we can, talk about a bit further as well.
So a very interesting research story there, Andrew, and outline, giving us a good starting sense of, where you've been, where you're coming from professionally. Let's now move on to the second segment of the interview, where we actually get to think more imaginatively, to Imagination Central. This is the part where we get to think beyond the business as usual futures, the some would term the failing futures we seem likely to be heading toward if we just keep on doing what we've always done, whether that's in the social policy, climate, or whatever other sector we're talking about. But instead, I want you to imagine better kinds of future, the sort of more progressive and hopeful futures that we've already started pointing toward. And I've talked about this contrast in more detail in the introductory episode of the series, about the stark contrast between either the failing or flourishing futures we could possibly achieve depending on the development decisions we choose to make. So perhaps have a listen to that episode if you haven't done so already. But right now, I want to ask you, Andrew, to do something using imagination, and of course listeners out there can join us if they wish. So I want you to imagine it's the year 2040, that's 15 years or so from now. We don't have a crystal ball because we're not trying to predict the future, but we do have a powerful future vision tool that often gets overlooked, our imaginations. So here's the task. I want you to picture that, thanks to some kind of sci-fi time travel device or time warp, you've just arrived in the year 2040, but this is not just any future year, because this one is flourishing, and you know that because you can see and sense it's climate safer, more socially inclusive, properly nature protected, and economically fairer in its share out of financial wealth and resources. It's clearly a future where no one is being left behind. And from across the imaginary 15 years or so between now and 2040, you've gathered evidence of some of the big progressive reforms which made this better, more flourishing 2040 future a reality. From the measurable differences made to reducing and adapting to climate disruption, to the greatly increased protection of natural areas, their species and tree cover, from widely available and genuinely affordable housing, to the excellent universal basic services of public transport, health, education and green spaces provided for all citizens. It's clear to you that all of these beneficial changes and many more have been put in place. And while you've been there in that better, flourishing, thriving 2040 future, imagine you've written a report, and in that report you captured many of the inspiring things you saw in 2040. So can you give us a bit of a summary of that report now? What did you experience in that flourishing 2040 well-being centred future world? What did you see, hear and experience?
Well, I'll talk about the climate change paper a bit later, but in terms of our current research, Andrew, in terms of disability and employment work and employment more generally, our sense of a utopia in an employment landscape would be workplaces that don't discriminate in any way. So you've got fair and inclusive recruitment processes. You have a range of supports that enable anybody with or without a disability to flourish in the workplace. We wouldn't see the discrepancy that we do at the moment in relation to unemployment between those groups or underemployment. And we would see that, people's abilities and gifts are utilised in the best way possible in all kind of workplaces. So that's the kind of, utopia and I suppose the future vision that we'd all like to see. And at the moment, obviously, we're currently working on, with organisations that are trying to, move in that direction.
And do you want to say something about climate change? You just mentioned it briefly there before, in terms of what you might see or imagine that you might see by 2040?
Yeah, well, our research, which we can delve into in a bit in detail, was looking at climate change advocacy and how climate change groups perform advocacy. And one of the things that we found was that there was a fair bit of inconsistency in the types of change these groups wanted to see, and quite a bit of discrepancy in how they articulated that change that they wanted to see. And so we know from research that if you are trying to get change at a system level that requires government to act, you need to be very clear and coherent in your message, and it needs to be shared by, a range of groups. So it is optimistic because obviously each group has a particular thing that they're passionate about, that they want to advocate for. But, what we would like to see obviously is a bit more consistency and a bit more coherence in the types of demands and the way they're communicating those demands from some of the climate change groups. So obviously, whatever the future holds, there'll obviously always be something that people want to improve on. And so that was kind of our, aim with that particular piece of research.
Okay, Andrew, thank you very much. Thank you for sharing some of your, visionary ideas for 2040, looking ahead. It's a foundational idea of this podcast series that the more people we can help to imagine what flourishing futures could look like, the more probable it will become that we can make them happen. And this is a bit of a conceit here, but this exercise, I just want to make sure in terms of a quick debrief, if anyone has been out there in podcast land doing this imagination exercise, let's just make sure we're safely back in 2025, because time travel can have a few fatiguing after effects at times. So just for the exercise, Andrew, what year is this? What year are we actually talking about?
Well, 2025, I think, at this point, but yeah, it's good to check.
That's good to know. Okay, so let's, staying in 2025 in the present moment. And I think you started to point to this in terms of some of your earlier comments just now. Another way we can use imagination to explore the possibilities for achieving flourishing futures is to look closely at what's already happening. I mean, you've already alluded to this to some extent, to try and identify so-called signals of the future. So what I mean by that is when we look around us, and we can often discover inspiring seeding opportunities, new initiatives, case studies, proofs of concept, bold, genuinely bold, new innovatory ideas on how to do things better, Such seeding opportunities can also be considered as early signs or signals of the kind of futures we'd actually like to see more of over the next 10, 15 or 20 years and beyond. So these signals of the future, these so-called signals, are not figments of the imagination because they actually exist here and now. But the question is, what if we could amplify them? What if these signals, these promising future-facing ideas and initiatives, perhaps in your case, Andrew, research areas, were supported, strengthened and multiplied? Could that help shift us more rapidly onto the pathways toward the sort of more thriving, life-enhancing and flourishing futures we've already started to talk about for 2040 and beyond? So the specific question for you, Andrew, within your own area of work and expertise, what do you see as some of the most promising ideas, new initiatives, signals, and do you have any ideas on how they might be strengthened going forward?
It's a good question. One of the things that we come across in our work, Andrew, is lots of very good practice. The question often is how to scale it. So as an example, we see some organisations doing fantastic work around employing young people with disabilities or people from refugee backgrounds or other particular groups that we know sometimes have difficulty getting into the labour market. And they're doing some social enterprises doing some fantastic work in that space. The challenge is, as I said, is scaling that kind of good practice. I don't have any kind of easy answers for you in that respect because it's kind of a complicated process of change. So it would have to require some shifts in values, shifts in government priorities, shifts in cultural practices around employers. So, there's quite a few things that would need to shift.
Okay, thank you. Well, there are some signals. Thanks for outlining those. Perhaps, as you pointed to, there are possibilities. Perhaps we just need in future to search for such signals, such whispers of the future. Search for them a bit more diligently, more carefully and imaginatively, and support their growth and spread with far greater determination. And that's where, you're pointing to some advocacy requirements there to push it along in your sector of interest. So now as we move toward the final part of today's conversation, I want to shift the time gears, as it were, one last time and bring us back to that energising vision of a preferred 2040 future that we started talking about earlier. And I want to do that because I want to help reinforce the idea that preferred future vision is absolutely required in our business as usual world of 2025 as a sort of counter to the fact that we know there are countless reasons that are always put forward to explain why a visionary and progressive idea or initiative cannot go ahead. And such allegedly realistic and can't do advice comes in a wide spectrum of rejection. Again, I've covered that point in more detail in the introductory episode of the series, so perhaps check that out. Suffice to say here that progressive thinking about preferable flourishing futures in the kind of imaginative forward-looking conversation we've been having today can perhaps start to dismantle some of the mental roadblocks to doing things differently that are often put up by naysayers and vested interests who frankly seem happy to keep the status quo going. Perhaps because it suits their profiteering bottom lines or hunger for power or both. But anyway, in light of the ringing endorsement of imaginative thinking running throughout this series, particularly used in the service of creating flourishing futures, let's come now to our last imaginative question and exercise and start to round off this great discussion. So, Andrew, imagine that you wake up tomorrow and you just know that, along with many other imaginative, like-minded people, you have your hands on the levers of great power which enables you to bring about wise and well-considered major changes and reforms to benefit our communities, but these would be beneficial reforms which cannot be blocked by business as usual. So the question is, from that imaginary scenario, describe up to 3 actions you would take starting tomorrow that could make it more likely that we would end up on better development paths by 2040.
Well, I'll talk specifically in relation to that question, Andrew, about the research that we did to give it some context for what I'm going to say. So, as I said, most of our work is around social policy and social programs, but we did do this piece of researchers who mentioned at the start on climate change advocacy. And what we were looking at, about, I think it was 30 or so climate change advocacy organisations, and we're interested in kind of what you've just posed there. What's their demand? What's their future vision that they're trying to articulate? And as you said, we use that intervention level framework, which was a summary of Meadows' leverage points. And what we were interested in is whether these groups were asking for what we consider very high leverage point change, which is in terms of articulating goals and visions for the future in the way you've just described. Were they articulating what we describe as middle leverage points? So that's in terms of who makes the decisions, how they make the decisions, what data is driving those decisions, and what kind of lower leverage points were they, trying to seek change for. And so that could be like things around specific projects, blocking a particular project or trying to get a renewable project up and running. Now, we call those lower leverage points because by themselves, while important, you need a whole collation of these kind of initiatives. And so what we found is that, as I said before, the groups were all a bit, incoherent, and not incoherent, that's the wrong word, but they were all inconsistent in the way they were describing their demands. A lot of the groups, or around 30%, had this vision for the future, what they wanted 2050 to look like, or 2040, in terms of, what climate change, would look like. There was a 50% of groups that were making demands very specific lower leverage points, so stopping a particular project, but there was much less attention to these middle leverage points. So articulating changes in who gets to make the decisions. So back to the thing you just asked me before, what change would I like to see in 2040? I would like to see reform in terms of that kind of thing. Organisations focusing on, well, who needs to make decisions around the environment, climate? How do we want those decisions made? What kind of data is driving those decisions? So that's seemed to be the area where there was less attention in terms of some of these climate change advocacy groups. There were some that we're doing, making some really terrific recommendations about joined up government across state and federal decision-making bodies, Climate Change Commission, better data on our, carbon emissions and so forth. But it was getting much less attention. And they're really important middle leverage points, because if we can get reform to that kind of thing about, who gets to make the decision, so we can think about vested interests, the role they're playing. That's where I think we, in terms of advocacy, there could be a bit more focus and a bit more attention. But, that was based on our 2019-2020 data, so there might have obviously been some shifts in, where attention's being placed. But certainly that was the findings from our research, and that's the kind of change we would like to see.
Just staying with that for a moment, and I just wondered if you could say a bit more about, you've pointed to this, but this whole series that we've been doing here is about the use of imagination, trying to boost public imagination, but not kite flying, credible, plausible futures that are coming out of data as well as lived experience and aspiration, for better ways of doing stuff, but also linking to stuff like case studies and all that. What do you, just going with that framework that you've mentioned, that leverage point framework, can you say any more about the role of imagination in that? Do you see a public imagination having a specific role, and where would it be within the actual points that you've just mentioned? I'm assuming it would be nearer the top of the list, but have I got that right?
Yeah, you've got that right. That's the sort of the Meadows talks about, sort of a paradigm shift. So that's what you're talking about in terms of like a complete change in how, the values of a society. So that's the kind of, the revolutionary change in a sense. That, environment's front and centre with all decision making, because that's the values of that of a society. So that's the kind of, big picture change in terms of, you I suppose, to articulate in the way that you've just asked that question.
Okay, thanks for that. Well, look, Andrew, coming now very, very close to the end of the actual conversation, for the absolute last question, which is just a round-up question for you. Do you have any parting words of wisdom for the audience, a pithy comment which summarises your core messages in this episode, or perhaps a suggestion for how listeners could get more deeply involved with the ideas and initiatives we've been talking about today? Anything you want to say in closing?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. What we were hoping from our research is not necessarily to, tell these, fantastic grassroots organisations what they should be advocating about, but just to think about some kind of framework by which they communicate the messages. And some groups are doing this really well. So trying to think about, okay, well, we're trying to stop this project going ahead. But what are some other leverage points that we could think about as well? And how could we make sure that the language we're using is consistent with the languages of other groups that are using as well? So that, the more clarity and the more consistency that we can get across the sector, the research says that that's more likely then to, gender change at that kind of system level. So that was kind of the main point from our research that we're hoping to get across.
So if I understand that correctly, that is something about messaging, the story that the groups tell in terms of their overall mission and purpose, and how they're progressing that on particular projects. Something about that is the communication.
Yeah, and that's right, and using Meadows or some other kind of way to conceptually think about what they're asking for. How does it fit together with what other groups are asking for? And how can we get some consistency?
So again, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but just drawing out some of the issues here for the sectors, for instance, that I work within, the not-for-profit sector, environmental education and capacity building. This would seem to point, but tell me if I got this wrong, it would seem to point to the value of alliance, at some level, alliance between groups. Greater degree of interconnection. If they're doing their separate things, but some degree of working together around messaging at least.
Yeah, I mean, there are some fantastic efforts. There's of climate alliance groups and trying to bring these groups together. So that work is happening, and there's lots of organisations that are collaborating and trying to work together. What we're suggesting is that in order to help that, there could be like a consistent way of communicating what they're asking. So think about sort of like a pyramid type shape. At the bottom of the pyramid is all our sort of lots of different projects. They're all, got our own thing we want to advocate for. It might be a gas or a coal kind of project, or a renewable project, or something to do with forest or sustainable diets. Like, there's all something that at that level that a group might be passionate about. But as we go up the pyramid, in the top of the pyramid is this kind of the paradigm change, and then some goals. And in the middle, there might be some reform to decision making. Obviously the Environment Act is something that's in the news at the moment. And so what we're suggesting is that there could be, a bit of consistency in terms of those different groups. Yes, be passionate about that topic, down the bottom of the pyramid, but maybe think about, what kind of reform would you like to see? As we've been discussing today, what kind of reform would you like to see in terms of how government makes decisions? What kind of reform would you like to see about the data that's driving those decisions? There are some groups that are articulating those kind of changes, but very few. What we're suggesting is that all advocacy climate groups or environmental groups could be also advocating for those kind of middle leverage points. And that, then creates further political pressure, if you will, to get that kind of change. Does that kind of make some sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think that that use of an image, in infographic, even though we're in audio and not visual, but I will put some links. So I know there are some good symbols and infographics on this sort of topic, online. I will put some links to those into the show notes so people can have a visual image of that in front of them. But I think that was a lovely way of you putting that. I like that, the pyramid of, if not inspiration, the period of activism, but linked to that leverage points model.
Yeah, well, I think what we've talked about, and not to sort of move away from your kind of future vision, but I think obviously the theme of your series here is around that kind of the top of the pyramid, the visionary paradigm change. What we're finding is a lot of groups are sort of at the bottom of the pyramid in terms of like small scale change. And we're hoping there's a bit more emphasis in the middle of that pyramid. So, okay, we're still within the existing paradigm, but can we improve how decisions are made? And can we do more advocacy at that kind of level?
Well, it seems that we need to climb the pyramid slightly. We need to be going up.
Oh, absolutely. You'd love to see change at all levels is what's required.
Well, that's a lovely, inspiring way to round off the conversation with that image of climbing the pyramid. Thank you so much one last time, Andrew, for your great contribution in this discussion today. Thank you.
No problem.
So, what will I take away from this great episode? I've listened back to it and I've just taken out several important ideas which came up into my head about trying to achieve system level change. Firstly, I just needed to remind myself that system level or systemic change, what that's about, it's about trying to change a whole system in a significant and lasting way. And whether that's a system of government, of politics, of the economy, or even a system of thought about how the world works. Look, it's an ambitious, bold approach to trying to bring about change. It's an approach that seeks to transform a system by addressing the root causes of the problems within it, not just trying to treat the symptoms of the problem. A bit like that medical analogy. Put it another way, it's primarily about achieving lasting beneficial changes through solid transformations of challenges, not just tinkering around their edges, as so much of our current approach to human development seems to involve. And I particularly like that idea of using a mental model or a framework, a pyramid of influence diagram perhaps, of the possible different points of influence or leverage that can be applied to try and change a system. Looking again at the infographic of the pyramid idea, I think we did mention that in the episode. It's in the show note links. That really did help solidify my understanding of what was being talked about. And although we were talking in the episode about climate change advocacy groups for a lot of the time, it also seemed to me that a pyramid of influence way of looking at how to bring about progressive change, that could apply whether we were talking about the environment, society or the economy and outcomes of change in those sectors. So I came to think that a pyramid of influence way of thinking about pushing for progressive change could become a valuable extra tool in the toolbox for any group working across any of those areas. And finally, I suppose, putting on that Imagineer hat from the series, I just further tried to visualise what the environment protection NFP NGO sector in, say, southern Queensland could look like by 2040. That is, if more organisations were thinking more strategically in system change terms, in the ways that Andrew and I were talking about in the episode. For instance, could we see more groups considering shifting their intervention level focus higher up the pyramid of influence, and what would such a shift require of them in practical operational terms? And would such a system change pyramid of influence way of thinking about their work encourage more groups to reach out to each other in realisation of an interconnected, bigger picture, common cause, allied interest they have in pushing back harder against diverse vested interests who seem happy to continue to exploit and damage what is left of our nature and natural systems for self-serving profit or power or both? Anyway, I've come away from this episode with some very intriguing further questions to ponder. At the end of each episode, I wonder what you, our listeners, our community of increasingly future literate, imaginative future thinkers, will take away from this episode and our energising journey into visualising possible pathways to better futures by 2040. We would like you to be part of this podcasting experiment in future vision imagination and to help us try to answer a question. Could a podcast series like this help with sparking the shift, the transition we so urgently need toward better, climate safer, properly nature protected, socially and economically fairer future development pathways? Only time will tell if we can answer this question, tied to the podcast's ambitious deeper purpose. In the meantime, we hope you will continue the conversation sparked by this episode in your homes, workplaces, communities, organisations, and anywhere ideas are shared. Perhaps you may be inspired to answer your own future vision questions, such as what could a more desirable, flourishing future in 2040 look like for me and for those around me? Or how might the imaginative tools used in each episode, 2040 time travel, signals of the future, and taking 3 powerful actions, help me reflect, frame, and communicate my hopes for a better tomorrow? If you're enjoying the series, please consider sharing it. And word of mouth remains one of the most powerful ways to grow a podcast audience, and perhaps an online community committed to cultivating flourishing futures. We'd also love to hear from you. What ideas or questions stood out? What resonated or challenged you? You can send us your reflections, comments or questions by email, social media, text or voice message. You'll find contact details via the Hope Incorporated Australia's website and in the episode show notes. We also welcome your suggestions for possible future guests, topics or ways we might improve the format of the series. We see this podcast as a collaborative project, and your input could help shape what comes next. So until the next episode, keep your imaginations active and alive, keep wearing your 2040 Flourishing Futures hats, and please keep sharing ideas about how, individually and together in visionary community, we can use the power of imagination to shift our development pathways toward a truly flourishing 2040 and beyond. My name is Andrew Nicholson, and thanks so much for listening. Hope Incorporated Australia, providing podcasts, research and community educational outreach to help achieve our vision of a society which is sustainable and just, ecologically, socially and economically. For more details on our work, please visit our website at www.hopeaustralia.org.au.